By the time Inspector Purbright arrived in Bramwell Parva, the village had already agreed on what had happened. This agreement had not been reached formally, nor with any enthusiasm. It had emerged the way such things often did in small places, through pauses, raised eyebrows, and the careful repetition of phrases like asterisk, most people would say. It was a phrase that allowed everyone to sound certain without committing to anything that might later require correction. Bramwell Parva valued that sort of certainty. The inspector's car drew no crowd. It paused by the green engine ticking, while a woman with a shopping trolley altered her route by several feet in order not to appear curious. From an upstairs window, a lace curtain was adjusted with care. The postman, having already told the story twice that morning, contented himself with a nod. Inspector Purbright stepped out, took in the low cottages, the trimmed hedges, and the faint smell of disinfectant drifting from the surgery at the corner. He noted these things without emphasis. He always did. His manner suggested he was visiting on an administrative error that might yet be resolved politely. The surgery door was closed, though it was a weekday morning. A printed notice had been taped inside the glass, slightly crooked. It announced a temporary closure, offered apologies, and provided a number that no one expected to ring. Beneath it, someone had added a handwritten line in blue ink, the letters neat but pressing too hard. Back soon. Purbright read it twice. He did not touch the door. Instead, he crossed to the bench opposite, where Mrs. Hargreaves sat with her hands folded around her handbag, as if waiting for a bus that had offended her. She looked up at him with relief that stopped just short of gratitude. "You'll be wanting to know," she said, before he could speak. "I imagine so," Purbright replied pleasantly. She leaned closer, lowering her voice out of habit rather than necessity. "It was the doctor, Dr. Calder. Everyone says he missed it." "Missed what?" She hesitated, displeased by the question. "The symptoms. That's the trouble. They were there apparently, just not obvious. Not until afterwards." Purbright nodded, encouraging nothing. Mrs. Hargreaves straightened. "Of course he's always been very attentive. My Harold said so, right up until the end." "The end of what?" She gave him a look of mild reproach. "Well, that's what people are trying to decide, isn't it?" The bell of the general store rang as the door opened, releasing Mr. Lenton and a smell of apples. He slowed when he saw Purbright, then continued at a speed that suggested indifference carefully practiced. The inspector thanked Mrs. Hargreaves and moved on, leaving her with the satisfaction of having been consulted. He did not write anything down. The notebook remained in his pocket, untroubled. At the far end of the green, the vicar was speaking to a man in a tweed jacket. Their heads inclined together, they broke apart as Purbright approached, both smiling too promptly. "Inspector," said the vicar, extending a hand. "We were just discussing the arrangements." "Arrangements tend to multiply," Purbright said, "particularly when they are provisional." The man in tweed cleared his throat. "There's no suggestion of impropriety," he said, with an air of having introduced the idea himself. "I hadn't made one," Purbright replied. Silence followed, brief but instructive. The vicar recovered first. "Dr. Calder was well respected," he said. "A pillar, really." "Pillars can obscure as well as support," Purbright observed mildly. Neither man laughed. They did not appear offended either, which told Purbright something he would consider later. He walked the length of the green once more, noting who avoided him and who failed to do so convincingly. By the time he returned to his car, the village had begun to revise its agreement, just slightly. Certainty, like sympathy, was proving adjustable. He started the engine, but did not drive away. Across the road, the surgery door remained closed, its notice fluttering when a bus passed. Purbright considered the word missed, how comfortably it sat on the tongue, how useful it was when responsibility needed softening. Missed suggested accident, distraction, human limits. It did not suggest choice. A woman he had not yet met emerged from the post office and paused, as if expecting him to wave. When he did not, she looked faintly disappointed, then reassured, and went on her way. The village was already practicing its explanations. Purbright checked his watch, then finally took out the notebook. He wrote one line, nothing more, and replaced it. What mattered, he suspected, would not be found in records or recollections offered too quickly. It would be in the tone people used when they believed themselves unheard, in the minor corrections they made to one another, in the places where sympathy became defensive. He drove off slowly, leaving the green intact behind him, and allowed himself a thin, private smile. Symptoms, after all, were not only physical. Some appeared only when observed too late. He suspected Bramwell Parva would resist diagnosis, preferring comfort to cure, and that the task ahead would involve listening longer than anyone liked, while the village, polite and reasonable, revealed itself through what it chose not to mention to strangers, especially those who asked gently and waited with patience learned elsewhere over many quiet years. The waiting room retained its shape even with the surgery closed, as if the chairs themselves expected an audience. Inspector Purbright returned late that morning, parking with the same care, and found the door open at last. The handwritten notice had been removed, though a faint rectangle remained on the glass, a cleaner memory of where reassurance had been placed. Inside, 3 people sat as though summoned by habit rather than appointment. None looked ill. Each appeared ready to explain something. Mrs. Dawkins occupied the chair nearest the door, her coat folded on her lap, handbag clasped with resolve. She greeted Purbright with a nod that suggested recognition without enthusiasm. Opposite her sat a young man in a work jacket, boots scrubbed beyond necessity. He rose halfway, then thought better of it. The third, a thin woman with rimless glasses, was leafing through an old magazine without turning pages. "Inspector," said Mrs. Dawkins briskly, "we were just saying how quiet it feels." "It often does," Purbright replied, "when noise has finished its work." The young man shifted. "It's not right, is it?" he said. "A place like this being closed makes people think." "They've already done that," Mrs. Dawkins said sharply. "Too much." Purbright took the remaining chair. He did not remove his coat. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and furniture polish, a combination intended to reassure. He let the silence settle until it grew uncomfortable enough to invite interruption. "It wasn't neglect," said the woman with glasses suddenly. "I've been reading about these things." "Reading can be persuasive," Purbright said, "depending on where one stops." She colored slightly. "I mean, symptoms can be subtle. Everyone knows that." "Everyone knows it now," Mrs. Dawkins said. "That's the difference." The young man cleared his throat. "My mum was here the week before. Dr. Calder saw her straight away, listened, didn't rush." Purbright nodded. "And the patient who concerns us?" A pause followed, during which each person appeared to assume someone else would answer. The magazine woman closed the cover with care. "Mr. Ellery," she said. "George Ellery. He'd been in and out." "How often?" "Enough," Mrs. Dawkins said. "Enough for someone to notice." "Notice what?" She frowned. That something wasn't right. Purbright smiled faintly. "That is usually the first symptom." The young man leaned forward. "Look," he complained. "Everyone knew that. Chest pain, tiredness, said it was nothing one day, everything the next. You can't blame a doctor for taking a man at his word." "No," Purbright agreed. "Blame is rarely efficient." Mrs. Dawkins stiffened. "Are you saying there was no mistake?" "I'm saying people are very clear about it," Purbright replied. Clarity has arrived quickly. The door opened, and the vicar entered, stopping short at the sight of Purbright. He recovered himself with a smile practiced at bedsides. "I see the place has reopened," he said. "For conversation," Mrs. Dawkins replied. "Not treatment." The vicar took a seat without invitation. "We're all feeling rather responsible," he said, "in our own ways." "That's generous," Purbright said. "Responsibility shared often feels lighter." The magazine woman bristled. "Someone has to be accountable." "Eventually," Purbright said, "but not prematurely." The young man stood. "I should get back. People will ask." "They will," Purbright said. "They always do." When he had gone, the room felt smaller. The vicar folded his hands. "Dr. Calder has given years to this village. It seems unfair to reduce his work to a single oversight." "Wimplayed speak old." "Is that what it was?" Purbright asked. The vicar hesitated. "That's what it's being called," Mrs. Dawkins sniffed. "Because it's kinder." "Than what?" She did not answer. Purbright rose, thanked them all, and stepped outside. The certainty he had found indoors clung to him like warmth from a fire. It was comfortable, shared, and faintly stifling. As he walked back to his car, he noticed how each explanation had fitted neatly, allowing sympathy without disturbance. From the doorway, the woman with glasses watched him go, her magazine forgotten. Certainty, he reflected, was often a waiting room in itself. People sat with it patiently, convinced they would be seen in time, rarely considering that the door might open onto something less familiar and far more difficult to dismiss. Inspector Purbright did not leave the village after the surgery. He walked instead, allowing the afternoon to arrange itself around him. Bramwell Parva responded with conversation, not directed, not withheld, but offered in portions that felt accidental and were not. Outside the bakery, two women discussed icing sugar and blood pressure in the same sentence. At the post box, a man explained the weather with emphasis, then added that Dr. Calder had always hated damp. Each remark carried a softness that discouraged reply. Purbright listened, nodded, and said little, which encouraged people to continue correcting themselves. He paused near the green where a small knot of villagers stood examining a notice board that had not been updated. Their talk drifted toward him without invitation. One voice insisted that George Ellery had been careless with his own health. Another suggested he had been stoic to a fault. Both sounded relieved by their conclusions. When Purbright asked what Ellery had been like, the answers lengthened and grew vague. Kind, difficult, private, generous, none incompatible, all safely final. At the butcher's shop, Miss Trent weighed sausages with ritual care. She greeted Purbright warmly, as if he were a cousin returned. While she wrapped paper, she spoke of queues, of shortages, of how people worried more than they used to. Only then did she mention that Dr. Calder had seemed tired lately, not unwell, just distracted. A man could miss things, she said, when everyone expected him not to. Purbright thanked her and noticed she had not mentioned George Ellery at all. Further along, he encountered Mr. Lenton again, this time leaning against his bicycle. Lenton spoke easily, cheerfully, about nothing of consequence. He described the Green's drainage problem and the council's indifference. Only as Purbright turned to leave did Lenton add that Ellery had cancelled an appointment once, hadn't wanted to bother the doctor. Lenton shrugged, apologetic on Ellery's behalf. It was the first hint that refusal might have flowed both ways. The inspector stopped by the churchyard, where the grass had been cut unevenly. The vicar was there, speaking to Mrs. Ellery. Their voices fell when Purbright approached, then rose again with determined normality. Mrs. Ellery spoke of practical matters. The vicar supplied sympathy with measured cadence. Neither mentioned symptoms. When Purbright offered condolences, Mrs. Ellery thanked him and said George trusted Dr. Calder completely. The vicar agreed too quickly. Trust, Purbright thought, was being used as a sealant. As he continued, the pattern clarified. Small talk was doing heavy work. It redistributed discomfort, spread it thin, and disguised it as community. Each conversation adjusted the shape of the story without changing its outline. Missed symptoms, human error, unfortunate timing, no villains required. Purbright noted who spoke first and who waited, who volunteered detail and who corrected it. Politeness, he observed, was not neutral. It steered. At the corner shop, the owner rang up a loaf and commented on how quiet things felt. When Purbright agreed, she smiled with relief and said people didn't like quiet. It made them think back. She added that George Ellery had been one to think back often. Nostalgic, she called him, with faint irritation. The inspector asked how that had shown itself. She hesitated, then said he kept old letters, from Dr. Calder, among others. Purbright felt the afternoon tighten slightly. He asked nothing further. He paid, thanked her, and stepped outside. The village continued to talk around him, smoothing edges, closing gaps. Each exchange carried the same careful weight, polite and insistent. He suspected the truth would not announce itself. It would slip, briefly when someone tried too hard to be agreeable. That, he decided, would be the moment worth noticing. He turned toward the lane leading past the school, where children's voices had once marked time. Now it was empty, and the quiet pressed differently. A woman watering her garden paused to speak, remarking on the inspector's patience. She said patience was a doctor's best quality, followed by a laugh that asked to be forgiven. Purbright accepted it with a smile. She added that George Ellery had disliked fuss. Doctors made fuss, she said, when patients insisted. George had never insisted. Near the school gate, a retired nurse stood reading a poster. She greeted Purbright with professional courtesy and volunteered nothing. When he asked about Dr. Calder, she spoke of systems, of workload, of the danger of hindsight. Her words were precise, clipped. She did not defend anyone. She simply redistributed responsibility until it dissolved. As they parted, she mentioned, as if unrelated, that Ellery kept meticulous notes of his appointments. The afternoon edged toward evening. Conversations thinned but did not end. From open doors came fragments of agreement, rehearsed and reassuring. Purbright felt the village settle into its version of events, polished by repetition. He wondered who felt least comfortable with it, and why. The answer, he suspected, would not be loud. It would be courteous, well-timed, and offered as if it were nothing at all. He made a final circuit, noting faces that turned away and those that held too long. The story's edges were smooth now, but seams remained. Somewhere between kindness and certainty lay the pressure point. Purbright did not yet touch it. He allowed the village to keep speaking, confident that politeness would eventually misstep, revealing what careful agreement could not entirely contain. He paused by his car, listening once more. The weight of small talk pressed, patient and persuasive. It promised comfort and delivered delay. Purbright understood its value and its risk. When everyone agreed too soon, something else was being protected. He opened the door, resolved to wait, and to keep waiting until the village tired of being reasonable. That weariness, he suspected, would arrive quietly, accompanied by a correction, a softer voice, and a detail offered late, precisely because it had been considered unimportant. Then, and only then, the story would begin to move away from comfort toward truer understanding. Inspector Purbright walked the short distance to George Ellery's house as the lights softened and the village began preparing its evening explanations. The cottage stood a little apart, modest, well-kept, and already altered by attention. A vase of flowers sat by the gate. Someone had swept the path with enthusiasm that bordered on apology. Two neighbors occupied the low wall opposite, engaged in a conversation that paused the moment Purbright appeared. They did not move away. Instead, they smiled with practiced readiness. Mrs. Cole spoke first. She always did. "We've been keeping an eye," she said, as if reporting weather. Poor Mrs. Ellery. Can't let her be alone too much. Her companion, Mr. Fitch, nodded agreement before it was required. "People mean well," he added. "Sometimes they mean it all at once." Purbright thanked them and asked if Mrs. Ellery was in. Mrs. Cole answered that she was resting, which was true in the way that allowed for interruption. Purbright did not press. He lingered by the gate, allowing the neighbors to settle into their helpfulness. "It's such a shock," Mrs. Cole continued. "One minute a man is popping in for milk. The next, well, you know." "I don't," Purbright said gently. "That's why I'm here." Mr. Fitch shifted, uncomfortable with the literalness. "There were signs," he said. "Afterwards, of course." "Of course." They spoke of George Ellery as if he were a project completed by committee. He had been private but pleasant, particular about his routines, grateful for small kindnesses. Mrs. Cole listed the meals she had delivered since the death, each described in detail sufficient to demonstrate effort. Mr. Fitch added that Ellery had complained occasionally about the surgery's waiting times, not angrily, just enough to be remembered now. Purbright asked when Ellery had last been seen well. Both neighbors answered at once, then corrected themselves. The timeline wavered, smoothed over by certainty that it was recent enough to feel regrettable. Dates were offered, withdrawn, replaced by impressions. The inspector nodded, allowing the account to finish itself. The front door opened and Mrs. Ellery appeared, wrapped in a cardigan despite the mildness. She looked surprised rather than distressed, as if grief had already been scheduled and accommodated. She greeted Purbright with courtesy and apologized for not inviting him in immediately. "No apology is needed," he said. "I was speaking with your neighbors." "Yes," she said, with a glance that carried both gratitude and fatigue. "They've been very kind." Mrs. Cole brightened. Mr. Fitch looked relieved. Inside, the cottage smelled of tea and furniture polish. Everything had been moved slightly, enough to signal care without rearrangement. Mrs. Ellery gestured to a chair, and sat opposite Purbright, hands folded neatly. She answered his questions without hesitation, her tone calm, almost instructional. George had trusted Dr. Calder. He had not liked fuss. He had believed symptoms should be borne quietly unless they became undeniable. Mrs. Ellery said this without criticism, as if repeating a rule they had both accepted. When Purbright asked if George had ever doubted his treatment, she shook her head. He wrote things down, she added. He always did. Notes help when memory wanders. May I see them? Purbright asked. She hesitated, just long enough to be noticed. They're rather personal. I understand, he said. Often they are. After a moment she rose and fetched a small notebook from a drawer. She placed it between them, not opening it. Purbright did not reach for it immediately. He asked instead about the neighbors, about how long they had known George. Mrs. Ellery smiled faintly. They mean well, she said. Sometimes they know more than we've told them. Outside, Mrs. Cole and Mr. Fitch had edged closer to the window under the pretense of adjusting the flowers. Their silhouettes hovered, attentive. Mrs. Ellery lowered her voice. People like to help, she said. It makes things simpler. For whom? Purbright asked. She did not answer directly. She opened the notebook herself and turned a few pages. Dates, times, brief descriptions, chest discomfort, fatigue, relief after rest. The entries were neat, disciplined, unadorned. Purbright read only what was shown to him. He did not ask to turn the page. Did the doctor see this? He asked. No, Mrs. Ellery said. George didn't bring it, he said. Dr. Calder had enough to manage. Purbright closed the notebook gently and returned it. The air in the room felt denser, weighted by restraint. From outside came Mrs. Cole's voice, raised slightly, discussing the weather with unnecessary volume. Purbright stood. He thanked Mrs. Ellery for her time and expressed his condolences again, which she accepted with composure. As he stepped outside, the neighbors converged with renewed purpose. Everything all right? Mrs. Cole asked. For now, Purbright replied. Mr. Fitch nodded, satisfied. As Purbright walked away, he reflected on the usefulness of neighbors. They observed, remembered, corrected, and comforted. They filled gaps eagerly. Yet in their careful watching, something else had been missed. Not symptoms, perhaps, but silence. The house behind him held more truth than the pavement allowed. He suspected that helpfulness had shaped the story early, smoothing it before it could settle naturally. By the time he reached the end of the lane, the neighbors were already comparing notes, their voices blending into agreement. Purbright continued on, carrying with him the image of a notebook unopened by the one person meant to read it, and the sense that the village's kindness, while sincere, had begun to interfere with understanding in ways that would soon matter. He slowed, letting dusk arrive fully, and considered how stories benefited from company. Alone they were awkward, incomplete. Shared, they gained confidence, even when inaccurate. Somewhere between the neighbor's care and Mrs. Ellery's restraint lay a detail still untouched. He intended to return, not to accuse, but to listen until the village tired of helping itself and spoke differently then. Inspector Purbright arranged his visit to Dr. Calder's house with deliberate informality. He rang the bell at a time that suggested courtesy rather than insistence, and waited long enough to show patience without retreat. The door was opened by Dr. Calder himself, who looked neither surprised nor entirely prepared. "Inspector," he said, after a fractional pause, "I wondered when you might come." Purbright smiled. "People usually do," he said. "I try not to disappoint them." Dr. Calder stepped aside at once. The hallway was narrow, orderly, and faintly overstocked with coats. A framed certificate hung slightly crooked, its authority softened by familiarity. The doctor gestured toward a sitting room that had been arranged to receive guests who rarely stayed long. They sat facing one another, knees aligned with professional symmetry. Dr. Calder folded his hands, then unfolded them again. "I've already given a statement," he said. "I've read it," Purbright replied. "I was hoping to hear what didn't make it in." Dr. Calder considered this, his expression cautious but not defensive. "I don't omit lightly. Few people do," Purbright said. "They simply choose." Tea was offered, declined, then accepted with visible relief. While the kettle boiled, Dr. Calder spoke of schedules, of patient lists, of the difficulty of balancing thoroughness with necessity. His tone was reasonable, practiced. Purbright listened without interruption. When they returned to their chairs, the doctor produced a folder and set it on the table between them. He did not open it. "George Ellery," he said, "a conscientious man, perhaps too much so." "In what way?" Purbright asked. He didn't want to impose. He described symptoms carefully, but sparingly, always minimized. "Did you encourage him to elaborate?" Dr. Calder hesitated. "I encouraged him to be specific." Purbright nodded. "Those are not always the same thing." The doctor's mouth tightened. Briefly, he spoke then of guidelines, of likelihoods, of patterns that usually proved reliable. He spoke of how chest discomfort presented in many forms, most of them harmless. He did not speak of doubt. "Did you ever suspect something more serious?" Purbright asked. "I considered it," Dr. Calder said. "One always does, but you did not say so." Dr. Calder looked down at the folder. "Saying so changes things." "It does," Purbright agreed. "For everyone." The doctor's voice softened. "George trusted me. I didn't want to alarm him unnecessarily." "And now?" Purbright asked. Dr. Calder met his gaze. "Now I wish I'd been less careful with reassurance." Silence followed, heavy but controlled. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with unnecessary clarity. Purbright allowed it to continue until the doctor shifted, uneasy with the absence of direction. "I didn't see his notes," Dr. Calder said abruptly. "I know he kept them now." "Did you ask?" Purbright asked. "No," the doctor admitted. "I assumed he would bring anything important." "Assumptions," Purbright said mildly, "tend to travel both ways." Dr. Calder's shoulders sagged slightly. "I didn't think he was hiding anything, nor did he think you were missing something," Purbright said. "Between you, something remained unsaid." The doctor opened the folder at last. Inside were appointment records, test results, referrals not made. Everything was in order. Nothing shouted. Purbright glanced through without comment. "Your statement is accurate," he said. "It is also incomplete." Dr. Calder closed the folder again. "What would you add?" Purbright leaned back. "I would add uncertainty." The doctor frowned. "That's hardly helpful." "It is honest," Purbright replied. "And honesty, in medicine as elsewhere, has consequences." Dr. Calder stood and moved to the window. Outside, the street was quiet. Neighbors' curtains half drawn. He spoke without turning. "People want certainty," he said. "They want reassurance. They want you to say everything will be fine, and if you don't, they find someone who will." Purbright considered this. "Did George ever ask you directly if something was wrong?" The doctor hesitated longer this time. "Once," he said, "near the end." "What did you say?" "That it was unlikely," Dr. Calder replied. "That we would keep an eye on it." "You did not say it was possible." "No." Purbright stood. "That may be the most important omission." Dr. Calder turned back, his expression troubled. "I didn't lie." "No," Purbright said. "You chose your words carefully." The doctor's voice sharpened. "Are you suggesting negligence?" "I'm suggesting silence," Purbright replied. "And silence can be persuasive." They stood facing one another, neither accusing, neither absolving. The tension lay not in confrontation, but in recognition. Dr. Calder looked suddenly tired. The confidence of habit eroded by reflection. "I meant to protect him," he said quietly. "And he meant to protect you," Purbright said. By not insisting, the doctor sank back into his chair. "Everyone keeps telling me I missed the symptoms." "Perhaps," Purbright said. "But perhaps what matters more is what was never spoken aloud." Dr. Calder rubbed his temples. "The village has already decided." "It often does," Purbright said. "Decisions made quickly feel merciful." "And are they?" Purbright considered the question. "Sometimes, until they aren't." He gathered his coat, thanked the doctor for his time, and moved toward the door. Dr. Calder followed, stopping him with a final question. "Inspector," he said, "do you think I could have changed anything?" Purbright paused. "I think conversations matter," he said, "especially the difficult ones." Outside, the air felt cooler. As Purbright walked away, he reflected on the careful language he had heard, the measured omissions dressed as professionalism. The village wanted a simple failure. The doctor wanted a forgivable one. Between them lay a truth shaped less by error than by restraint. What the doctor had not said had allowed others to fill the space, and they had done so eagerly, with kindness and certainty. Purbright suspected that before the matter could rest, that silence would need to be examined alongside every word spoken in its place. Inspector Purbright did not leave Dr. Calder's street immediately. He walked the length of it twice, reading nothing in particular, allowing the conversation to settle. Professional courtesy, he reflected, was not merely politeness between occupations, but a shared understanding of restraint. One did not press too hard, not because answers were unavailable, but because pressing altered them. At the end of the street he encountered Sergeant Wilkes, newly arrived, standing beside the car with a notebook already open and expectations neatly arranged. Wilkes looked relieved, then uncertain, adjusting his stance as Purbright approached with the unhurried calm that suggested nothing urgent had occurred, which was rarely accidental. Wilkes waited, accustomed to following rather than initiating under such circumstances. Quietly now, Wilkes began to speak, then stopped, recognizing the signal to proceed carefully. He spoke instead of procedure, of statements taken and files requested, all delivered with respect that bordered on deference. Purbright listened, asking only when necessary, and even then with phrasing that softened intent. The sergeant mentioned the doctor's colleagues, the locum who had covered occasionally, the regional consultant who reviewed referrals. Nothing irregular surfaced, which itself required attention. Professional courtesy extended beyond individuals. Institutions protected themselves through language. Wilkes admitted the village expected reassurance, not inquiry. Purbright said expectations were often diagnostic. He suggested patience reassured communities while time quietly rearranged responsibility without visible force. Wilkes nodded, recognizing the method from prior cases he preferred not remembering fully. They walked together toward the village center, conversation loosening as formality eased. Wilkes spoke of Mrs. Ellery's notebook, now logged but unopened by authority, out of courtesy. Purbright approved. Courtesy could preserve context where haste destroyed it. They passed villagers who greeted them with studied normality, eyes flicking between uniforms and expressions. One man offered condolences meant for neither officer. Another praised Dr. Calder loudly, as if volume could substitute argument. Wilkes observed that sympathy traveled faster than facts. Purbright replied that speed often hid direction. The sergeant asked what they were looking for. Purbright said they would know when politeness failed. Failure, he added, rarely announced itself, preferring gentle corrections and delayed acknowledgments over time and repetition within conversations. They stopped outside the surgery again, now locked for the evening. Wilkes asked whether to request records formally. Purbright advised waiting. Formal requests stiffened spines and simplified stories prematurely. He preferred drift, the slow realignment of certainty under sustained listening. A woman approached to ask whether the doctor would return soon. Wilkes answered gently. Purbright watched her accept the answer without relief. After she left, Wilkes remarked that everyone wanted closure. Purbright said closure was often rented before being earned. The sergeant smiled despite himself. He asked if they suspected wrongdoing. Purbright said suspicion was a tool, not a destination. He suggested observing who resisted patience, since impatience frequently betrayed deeper personal investments in quiet village disputes and medical failures. Wilkes departed to make calls, leaving Purbright alone with the square. The inspector sat briefly on the bench, considering the boundaries professionals drew around themselves. Doctors, police, clergy, all shared a language of mitigation. Errors became oversights. Silence became caution. He recalled Dr. Calder's phrasing, the careful absence of possibility. Purbright understood the impulse. Words carried consequences, and restraint felt humane. Yet humanity could blur responsibility without erasing it. A child crossed the green on a bicycle, rang a bell, and vanished. The sound lingered oddly. Purbright stood, sensing the inquiry required collaboration without collusion. He resolved to speak next with those accustomed to professional boundaries yet unburdened by loyalty. Such intermediaries often noticed omissions first through habit and training. He found the retired nurse again near the school, locking a gate with deliberate slowness. She greeted him with recognition, unsurprised. Purbright asked about professional courtesy, using the phrase directly. She smiled thinly. Courtesy, she said, was how systems survived mistakes without panic. It required mutual discretion and shared silence. When Purbright asked who benefited, she answered that everyone did, until they didn't. She spoke of meetings where concerns were softened, of notes edited for clarity. Not falsified, she emphasized. Clarified. Purbright asked whether clarification ever concealed risk. She replied that concealment was rarely intentional, merely convenient. She warned that convenience accumulated quietly, becoming tradition before anyone noticed its weight, especially in close communities where reputations mattered greatly to everyone. Purbright asked about George Ellery. The nurse considered, then said, "Ellery asked careful questions, the sort that sought permission to worry." She admitted she had once suggested he insist on further tests. He had smiled, thanked her, and said Dr. Calder knew best. Professional courtesy, she observed, was learned early. Patients practiced it too. It discouraged insistence and rewarded trust. Purbright asked whether she regretted not pressing harder. She said regret required believing authority welcomed challenge. They stood quietly, the schoolyard empty behind them. Purbright sensed the story tightening, not toward blame but toward pattern. Courtesy had shaped every exchange, smoothing edges, delaying friction, until urgency found no voice. He thanked her and left, recognizing the professional reflex that had governed compassion throughout the village. It was efficient, humane, and potentially dangerous when urgency depended on disruption rather than agreement. As evening settled, Purbright returned to his lodging, notes still sparse. Professional courtesy had emerged not as concealment, but as choreography, guiding speech and silence alike. He understood now that the village's consensus rested on mutual protection, a web woven gently and with good intention. Breaking it would require no confrontation, only patience and precise listening. Somewhere courtesy would falter, revealing an inconsistency too small to defend. Purbright prepared to wait for that moment. He closed his notebook, satisfied that the next development would arrive not through accusation, but through someone, finally, choosing honesty over reassurance, and finding the courage to say what had previously seemed unsayable. It would be offered casually, perhaps apologetically, and change everything without appearing dramatic. Until then, professional courtesy would continue to manage discomfort efficiently, maintaining order while obscuring urgency beneath familiar civility and calm. The following morning, Inspector Purbright returned to the village with the sense that yesterday's courtesy and careful observation had shaped only part of the picture. The air was crisp, dew still on the hedges, and Bramwell Parva appeared undisturbed, as if awaiting judgment with polite patience. Purbright walked toward the Ellery residence, noting the arrangements of morning routines, the baker already placing loaves in the window, the postman adjusting his bag with habitual precision. Even these small actions carried the weight of expectation, as if everyone performed for an audience that had yet to arrive. Assumptions, he reflected, were inherited more readily than instructions. At the cottage gate, Mrs. Cole and Mr. Fitch were already present, inspecting the garden's new blooms with excessive interest. They greeted him with nods that conveyed readiness to report, yet neither spoke first. Purbright waited. Mrs. Cole eventually began. "It's all so sudden," she said. "One never expects these things. One relies on the usual order," Mr. Fitch added. "People forget the small signs. They think they notice, but they rarely do." He looked at Purbright with a glance that implied both warning and confession. Assumptions, the inspector noted, were now shared, communal, and lightly defended. Mrs. Ellery emerged from the house, wearing a cardigan that had seen several winters. She did not greet him immediately. Instead, she attended briefly to a kettle, then gestured him inside. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and faint tea, a combination intended to calm. She sat, hands clasped neatly, eyes composed. Purbright observed her posture and tone. Composed, polite, yet hinting at restraint exercised over both grief and disclosure. The inherited assumptions of the neighbors were mirrored in her quiet responses. She did not need to be defensive. The village had already framed the narrative for her. Purbright asked casually about George's routines, his notebooks, the sequences of appointments and unspoken concerns. Mrs. Ellery answered without embellishment. The entries he had seen previously were orderly, punctiliously precise. She noted small deviations, a forgotten morning walk, a postponed delivery, a cancelled visit. None seemed dramatic in isolation. Purbright listened, noting how each was immediately contextualized by the surrounding neighbors' vigilance. The weight of community attention had shaped the record's presentation, subtly guiding what was recorded and what was omitted. Assumptions were not idle. They inherited momentum, smoothing facts to fit a collective expectation of propriety. The conversation shifted, almost imperceptibly, to Dr. Calder. Mrs. Ellery described his attentiveness, the respect he commanded, the trust George placed in him. Each descriptor was carefully neutral, but embedded within the phrasing was the acknowledgement of unspoken decisions, restraint, and tacit understanding. George relied on him entirely, she said, as did we all. Purbright noted the use of we, the inclusive assumption that the doctor's actions were approved by the wider circle, though silently. Assumptions like the air in the room were invisible but pervasive. Mrs. Cole and Mr. Fitch, still stationed near the window, chimed in without invitation, recounting their observations. What they had seen, what they had corrected for, the moments they interpreted and preserved for later repetition. Their accounts aligned closely with Mrs. Ellery's, each reinforcing the shared assumption. Nothing was neglected intentionally. The situation had escalated quietly, beyond anyone's immediate perception. Purbright allowed their words to settle. The assumptions themselves were now participants, shaping understanding as much as evidence might have. The inspector asked who had first noticed George's discomfort. Answers diverged, then reconciled into polite consensus. Small complaints, minor fatigue, nothing dramatic until the culmination. Each participant's recall had been filtered through communal expectation, a soft rehearsal of propriety and concern. Purbright recognized that inherited assumptions could be misleading. They imposed coherence on events that were in fact uneven and subtle. He noted inconsistencies, minute yet telling, between what was reported immediately and what was inferred later. Mrs. Ellery excused herself briefly, leaving the neighbors and Purbright alone. Mr. Fitch spoke quietly, lowering his voice, as if confessing. "We all assumed someone else would act," he said. "Each of us thought the others were watching more closely." Mrs. Cole nodded. "We trusted George to speak up, Dr. Calder to notice, and each other to intervene if needed." Purbright made no comment. The pattern was clear. The very trust that ensured civility had created gaps. Assumptions had inherited responsibility from one to the next, diffused until no single party could claim comprehensive oversight. Mrs. Ellery returned, bearing a small envelope. She handed it to Purbright without explanation. Inside were copies of letters George had received from distant relatives, expressions of concern and inquiries regarding his health. Each was polite, tentative, and deferred to his judgment. Purbright read them carefully, noting how external expectations had mirrored internal assumptions, deferential, concerned, yet non-directive. Everyone had acted with the best intentions, guided by inherited belief in others' attentiveness. He stood to leave, offering thanks. Mrs. Ellery smiled faintly, acknowledging the weight she carried without complaint. The neighbors returned to their window, resuming observations as if his presence had been a brief interruption. Purbright walked away slowly, reflecting that inheritance of assumptions could be more binding than formal rule. It shaped actions, curtailed questions, and preserved appearances. Somewhere between kindness, duty, and deferment lay the true obstacle to clarity. The task ahead required careful disentanglement of these inherited assumptions, and he intended to trace them, one by one, to their origin. Inspector Purbright returned to the village square just as the late afternoon sun angled across the rooftops, casting long shadows that suggested caution rather than drama. The usual cluster of villagers had gathered, drawn by the predictable rhythm of the day, conversations measured, opinions stated, then quietly checked against one another. Voices rose and fell, reasonable in tone, almost rehearsed in timing. Purbright walked among them without interruption, observing how agreement and correction interwove seamlessly. Reasonable voices, he reflected, could carry half-truths with the same authority as certainty. Mrs. Dawkins spoke first, recounting George Ellery's recent habits. She emphasized moderation, citing small inconveniences rather than discomfort. Nearby, Mr. Lenton interjected with parallel stories, minor delays, trivial complaints, ordinary frustrations that now felt significant only in hindsight. Purbright noted how each narrative reinforced the other, a chorus of civility amplifying assumptions while suppressing doubt. A young mother nodded emphatically, adding a fragment from an overheard conversation with a nurse. The voices were plausible, orderly, almost soothing, yet the rhythm of their confidence hinted at gaps, pauses where uncertainty should have been acknowledged. He paused by the notice board. Several villagers leaned close, discussing appointments and schedules with gentle precision, as if ensuring no detail contradicted collective memory. Every correction was polite, phrased as guidance rather than correction. Purbright listened to how emphasis shifted subtly. Fatigue described as habitual, chest discomfort framed as inconsequential, postponed visits as unremarkable. The aggregation of voices created a comforting narrative, one that required no confrontation, no examination of individual responsibility. Reasonable voices, he noted, often acted as their own defense. Across the green, the vicar spoke with measured cadence, offering words of sympathy that reinforced propriety. "It is natural to worry," he said, voice calm, "but we must remember the intention behind each action." Mrs. Ellery stood nearby, listening quietly, nodding with faint appreciation. Purbright observed how her restraint encouraged the community's collective framing. When he asked a passing farmer about George's last week, the answer was delayed, filtered through the expectation of consensus. Each respondent qualified their statement, softening assertions with hedges of civility. "As far as I know, I believe," it seemed. Purbright followed a trail of these voices to the post office, where Mr. Fitch was recounting details to anyone within earshot, shifting emphasis from symptoms to courtesy, from oversight to circumstance. "He never complained loudly," Fitch said. "He trusted the doctor, and we trusted him to speak if something mattered." Mrs. Cole nodded beside him, adding that the community had assumed the doctor was alert, that concern would be shared before necessity became urgent. Reasonable voices repeated, reinforced expectations, each layer of repetition lending weight to collective interpretation. The inspector asked about minor deviations, missed walks, late deliveries, letters unopened. The answers were consistent, yet cautious. No one contradicted another. Instead, they adjusted phrasing to align with prior statements, smoothing irregularities into conformity. Even hesitation was polite, appearing as thoughtful reflection rather than uncertainty. Purbright noted the subtle rhythm of omission and inclusion, the gentle negotiation of what could be admitted without disruption. From a distance, children's laughter rang across the green, unnoticed by the main circle. Their unpredictability contrasted with the deliberate cadence of adult speech. The inspector considered how easily reasonable voices could obscure nuance, how civility functioned as both comfort and barrier. By the time he turned toward the lane leading to the surgery, he had a map of assumptions, corrections, and deferrals, all carried by words shaped to preserve harmony. Each statement was logical, yet each concealed a small vital detail in plain sight. He paused at the corner, listening as neighbors compared notes on Dr. Calder's attentiveness, George's habits, and the pace of recent events. Consensus had formed quietly, reinforced by repetition and politeness. Purbright recognized that intervention, if needed, would require subtlety, a gentle rearrangement of assumptions rather than forceful questioning. Reasonable voices, he realized, could carry truth as easily as misdirection. The difference lay not in their tone, but in what they left unspoken. He continued down the lane, the square's echo fading behind him. Somewhere along the way, the first fracture of certainty would appear, a moment when a voice misjudged emphasis, or phrased honesty too plainly. That fracture, he knew, would reveal the real sequence of events more effectively than any confession or accusation. Until then, the village spoke in measured tones, their reasonableness both shield and signal, guiding perception while concealing gaps beneath the soft weight of shared expectation. The next morning, Inspector Purbright returned to the Ellery cottage with the sense that yesterday's observations had only traced the periphery of the truth. The gate was open, the air crisp with dew and faint anticipation. Mrs. Ellery appeared at the door, her expression carefully neutral, as if weighing how much of her own discomfort to display. Purbright greeted her politely, noting how the very rhythm of her gestures suggested an inherited understanding of what could be said and what must be measured. She invited him inside, where the living room smelled faintly of tea and polished wood, a quiet formality that masked the subtle tension beneath. "Inspector," she began, voice composed, "I thought you might wish to see the correspondence George left behind." She handed over a bundle of letters and notes neatly tied with a ribbon. The entries within were careful, precise, yet incomplete, as though George himself had distributed responsibility across his own records, assuming others would notice what he did not say. Purbright leafed through them slowly, recognizing the pattern, small signs recorded, context implied, urgency tempered by consideration. The error, he realized, had been shared unevenly between those who acted and those who assumed action would follow. Mrs. Cole and Mr. Fitch were present, stationed politely near the window. Their voices joined the room gently, offering clarifications without asserting authority. "He never complained too loudly," Mrs. Cole said, smoothing over any hint of criticism. Mr. Fitch nodded. "We thought someone else would notice. Each of us assumed the others were watching more carefully." Purbright absorbed their phrasing, noting the cumulative effect, the same event interpreted differently by multiple observers, each with genuine intent, yet none accounting for the gaps left by shared reliance. Mrs. Ellery added softly that George had occasionally mentioned feeling short of breath, but had always described it as minor, ordinary, and passing. She had assumed Dr. Calder would act if necessary. Dr. Calder, she said, trusted George to mention anything pressing. The error, Purbright reflected, was neither malicious nor negligent. It had merely been distributed across the village's web of attention, its weight uneven, fragmented, and easily overlooked in collective memory. He asked about the doctor's visits, the conversations that had taken place, and the minor delays in appointments. Answers came in polite synchrony. The doctor had been thorough within reason, the patient had been cautious with words, neighbors had been attentive but not insistent. Each participant framed their account with reassurance, protecting both themselves and others. Yet the alignment of civility concealed the unevenness of responsibility, leaving crucial details muted beneath layers of courtesy. Mrs. Ellery paused, her hands clasping the edge of the table. "Perhaps we all believed someone else would speak first," she said. "I never imagined anyone would assume inaction meant approval or neglect." Purbright nodded. The phrasing was precise, a gentle acknowledgement of shared error, acknowledging oversight without assigning blame. It was the very mechanism by which the village maintained harmony, even as it allowed mistakes to propagate quietly. Outside, the neighbors murmured to one another, their observations filtered through the lens of courtesy and expectation. Purbright noted that their voices, reasonable and sincere, were now shaping memory more than fact. Each person had acted according to inherited assumptions, the sum of which had produced an uneven distribution of responsibility. He turned back to Mrs. Ellery, asking if George had ever questioned the absence of urgent intervention. She shook her head. "He trusted, and we trusted him to trust," she said. The web was clear. Each participant had deferred, not through negligence, but through polite, unspoken expectation. Purbright realized that uncovering the truth required tracing this diffusion of judgment, mapping where reliance had supplanted action. He stood, gathering the letters carefully, his mind cataloguing each subtle misstep and unspoken expectation. The error was tangible, yet it had been carried lightly, unevenly, through intention, habit, and courtesy. Purbright knew that the resolution would not rely on accusation, but on clarifying where each assumption had shifted responsibility, and how the village's kindness had unwittingly amplified the consequences. He stepped outside, the air fresh and still, the weight of shared error pressing silently, patiently upon the village, ready to reveal its first fracture under precise observation. Inspector Purbright returned to the village hall as afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, dust motes suspended like silent witnesses. A small gathering had assembled, largely those who had witnessed the events surrounding George Ellery, along with neighbors who considered themselves unofficial intermediaries. Purbright observed their gestures first, the careful folding of hands, the subtle alignment of chairs, the polite avoidance of direct eye contact. Manners, he thought, often preceded conclusions, shaping perception before facts had fully settled. Mrs. Cole spoke with calm insistence, recounting George's last week with an emphasis on politeness rather than drama. Mr. Fitch nodded, supplying minor details: a delayed post, a postponed walk, an ordinary cough. Each statement was hedged with civility, repeated gently to ensure consensus rather than contradiction. Purbright listened, noting how the assembly's conduct shaped interpretation. Manners moderated the retelling, creating a framework in which assumptions were safe and conclusions were postponed. Mrs. Ellery entered quietly, carrying a small tray of tea. She moved with measured grace, ensuring the conversation continued without abrupt interruption. Purbright accepted the tea with a nod, careful not to draw attention to formality over inquiry. He asked casually about George's communications with Dr. Calder. Mrs. Ellery explained that notes were exchanged, observations shared, but nothing had been emphasized beyond polite suggestion. "We all assumed the others would act where needed," she said. The phrasing carried no blame. The weight of oversight was shared equally, diffused by civility. As she spoke, the neighbors murmured in agreement, soft voices confirming timing, attendance and perceived concern. Each contribution was couched in deference. "As far as I know, I believe," we thought. Purbright noted the repetition. Manners had woven a lattice that held fact and assumption together, yet left gaps invisible until carefully examined. The polite cadence of agreement was as important as the words themselves. He asked if anyone had challenged the doctor's guidance directly. Answers were hesitant, polite. Mrs. Ellery explained that George rarely questioned authority aloud. The neighbors added that they too had deferred, preferring harmony over insistence. Each statement reinforced the collective habit of deference. Purbright realized that the village's manners had postponed conclusions, but also obscured urgency. The careful attention to decorum had allowed the uneven distribution of responsibility to remain unnoticed. A clock chimed gently, punctuating the room's calm. Purbright observed how the group flinched slightly, as if the sound reminded them of order and timing, not consequence. He probed, asking about small deviations in George's routine, late appointments, brief ailments, fleeting complaints. Each example was framed within polite interpretation, minimizing worry, highlighting effort, and softening any implication of oversight. "Did anyone think something might be seriously wrong?" he asked, voice neutral. The room hesitated, then replied with deference. Each thought someone else would notice, each deferred, each relied upon the collective restraint and judgment of others. Manners had dictated the response before honesty could emerge. Purbright sipped his tea, allowing the silence to settle, and noted the subtle interweaving of civility and perception. He understood that uncovering the truth required not confrontation, but careful navigation of the lattice the villagers had constructed. Manners had come first, conclusions deferred. Now he considered, patience and observation might reveal the hidden fractures in that lattice, where politeness had unintentionally protected missteps and allowed the situation to escalate quietly beneath the calm surface of shared restraint. By mid-morning, the square had taken on its accustomed quiet, punctuated only by soft footsteps and the occasional murmur of gossip restrained by habit. Inspector Purbright walked slowly among the familiar faces, noting their careful attention to appearances, the straightening of coats, the subtle adjustment of hats, the polite avoidance of any glance that might suggest judgment. There was a rhythm to the village's awareness, one that allowed them to maintain dignity while acknowledging what everyone had long suspected but never named aloud. Mrs. Ellery stepped onto her porch, nodding at neighbors who passed with measured greetings. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who understood that information, once spoken, could not be retrieved. Purbright approached her, noting how her expression betrayed neither surprise nor alarm, only the faint recognition that the patterns of observation and assumption had led here naturally. The village had been aware collectively of George Ellery's gradual decline. What remained was merely the articulation of what had been tacitly acknowledged for weeks. Conversations unfolded in soft clusters, as neighbors shared fragments of observation, the shorter walks, the paused greetings, the notes George had left untended. Each report was couched in civility, each phrase measured against the collective memory of others. Purbright listened, absorbing the subtle variations between accounts, differences were minimal, omissions were intentional only in their restraint. The village spoke in harmony with its prior knowledge, confirming rather than discovering, articulating what had been quietly understood. Dr. Calder appeared at the surgery door, his presence calm yet deliberate. He exchanged polite greetings with Purbright, then moved aside to acknowledge neighbors who had assembled with no expectation of formal instruction. Everyone spoke cautiously, carefully, avoiding accusation. The doctor's measured words aligned with the pattern. Nothing urgent had been neglected intentionally, but awareness had been dispersed among multiple participants, each assuming the other would act. Purbright observed how recognition of shared understanding, long deferred, was now surfacing with gentle consensus. Mrs. Cole and Mr. Fitch, stationed nearby, provided minor elaborations, their accounts corroborating earlier observations. "He didn't complain loudly," Mrs. Cole repeated, her phrasing deliberate. Mr. Fitch added, "We assumed others were paying closer attention." Purbright noted the repetition, not as redundancy, but as collective affirmation. The village was reconstructing its own awareness, confirming that the facts had existed in communal consciousness before they had been spoken aloud. A child's laughter from the lane reminded Purbright that normality persisted alongside retrospective clarity. Neighbors glanced at one another, acknowledging that the unspoken had always been present, that assumptions and attentiveness had interwoven into a subtle net of observation. Purbright realized that no single testimony had revealed the full picture. It had emerged gradually, collectively, from the accumulation of small recognitions, each polite, each carefully rendered. He approached Mrs. Ellery once more, asking if George had ever hinted at concern beyond ordinary complaints. She shook her head lightly. "He relied on the understanding around him," she said. "We all did." Purbright understood. The village had always known, even if it had not been voiced. The revelation lay not in discovery, but in acknowledgement. The cumulative effect of attentive civility, professional discretion, and neighborly care had created a shared truth that now required only articulation to be recognized. By late morning, the village had begun to reconcile its awareness with its conversations. Statements were repeated, corrected gently, aligned with prior understanding. The inspector noted that in such communities, knowledge often preceded declaration. Acknowledgement was the final act, the public confirmation of a private certainty. The story had existed in fragments, now united by shared recognition. Purbright walked through the square, absorbing the subtle shifts in posture, the quiet nods, the polite, almost ritualized exchanges. The village had learned what it knew all along, and in that learning the tension that had accompanied uncertainty began to relax. Awareness and civility had merged seamlessly, creating a consensus that was both comforting and truthful, revealing that clarity sometimes requires no intervention beyond patient observation and the articulation of long-standing, reasonable knowledge.